Hello world, it's Austin. Let's talk about being transgender and Christian. So I went on a little bit of a Twitter rant the other day about how frustrated I get when I hear people tell a trans person that they need to practice self-denial and they need to, give up their life for Christ, because I think that it's a part of our theology that's really misused, and I think it's worth talking a little bit about today. It's a hard thing to talk about, and I am going to talk a little bit about death, so if this is something that's going to trigger you, feel free to just turn off the video now and come back next week. That's totally fine. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Self-denial and dying to the self is a really big theme in Christianity, and we often think about how Jesus said that we need to deny ourselves in order to follow him. We also might think about Ephesians 4:22, which talks about how we need to give up our old selves, and we might think about Paul's letter to the Romans, which is filled with thoughts about how we die with Christ. And somehow in all of this talk about dying and denying ourselves, some Christians have gotten it into their heads that transgender people just need to deny their gender identity and cut off this huge part of themselves because that's what God would want them to do. Now, I understand where this line of thinking is coming from, because if you think that being transgender is a sin, then it makes sense that God would want you to give up that sin. Paul says in Romans 6:11 that we should consider ourselves dead to sin, so maybe that's where this is coming from for some people. So I have 4 thoughts about this whole argument. First of all, as you know, I don't think there's any biblical precedent for believing that being transgender is a sin. If there's a convincing argument that my gender identity is something that God doesn't support, I have yet to see it or hear it, and researching this stuff is basically my full-time job. Second, I think we really need to take into account the effects of telling a community that already has incredibly high rates of murder and suicide that they need to give up their life, even if we're speaking metaphorically. And sometimes it's hard when we're talking about this part of Christianity to know if we even are speaking metaphorically. There's no doubt that some of the early Christian martyrs, like Stephen, who we meet in the book of Acts, did indeed die for their faith. And throughout Christian history, there have been people who have been killed for their faith, or their faith has encouraged them to stand up for something that they thought was wrong, that was also a very dangerous thing to be against. But never in the whole history of the Bible is somebody asked to decide to literally die because God wants them to. Jesus is the only person who even comes close, and even he gets a chance to opt out in the Garden at Gethsemane. But okay, say that we are speaking completely metaphorically here. Do the transgender teenagers in our youth groups know that? Do the people who maybe didn't grow up in a church community and maybe haven't read the Bible, do they know we're speaking metaphorically? What are transgender people hearing, whether they're Christian or not, when you tell them that they need to take a huge part of themselves and cut it off or kill it? This is a dangerous part of Christian theology, and it's super easy to be misunderstood, and it's super easy to accidentally say something that somebody takes in the wrong way or in a literal sense, and I think we need to be really careful about how we use these words, and I think they're being misused against trans people. The third thing I want to talk about is that when the Bible talks about self-denial, it's usually pretty specific about what we're supposed to be denying. Paul's letters, for instance, are full of these things called vice lists, which are basically just huge groups of things that we should not do. Paul says we should give up gluttony and jealousy and anger and stealing and idolatry, all emotions and actions that hurt ourselves and other people and our world. Jesus also sometimes specifically tells people to give up material things, like when he tells the rich young man that he needs to go and sell everything he owns and give it to the poor. So I'm not saying we shouldn't follow these instructions. I'm not saying that we shouldn't practice self-denial. We do it a lot of the time in Lent, and I think it's probably a good spiritual practice. All I'm saying is that there's no real biblical precedent for going to trans folks and talking to them about self-denial and saying that they should be giving up their names and their pronouns and their clothing and their self-expression and their voices and their bodies and their lives. The last thing I want to point out is that when we see this call in the Bible to deny ourselves or to put part of ourselves to death, when we see that in the Bible, it always comes right before a call to a more abundant life. The goal is never to just see how much pain we can take and how miserable we can make ourselves and other people around us. When we're called to self-denial, it's because it's part of the road to an extraordinary life. Let's take a look at the Gospel of John for a minute, because this book is all about the call to life. John chapter 10, verses 7 through 10 goes like this. So again Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and bandits, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved, and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So let's recap. Number 1, being trans is not a sin. Number 2, we need to be careful about how we use these verses and the theology of self-denial because it can be really harmful to people if used in the wrong ways. Number 3, we shouldn't use self-denial and the theology of dying to the self to try to talk trans people out of their gender identity because, frankly, it's not relevant. And 4, remember that God is not calling us to beat each other over the head with Bibles until we're broken and miserable. God is calling us to eternal, abundant, truthful, authentic, communal life in the kingdom. Thanks for making it through the video with me this week, everybody. I know it was kind of heavy. As you can tell, I have a lot of feelings about this. I'd love to hear your feelings about it, so put them in the comments below. Always remembering to be kind to the other commenters. We're going to have another video that's a little bit like this one, a little bit on the same topic next week, and I'm excited for that as well. I hope you'll come back next week, and we'll see you then. In the meantime, have a great week, and yeah, peace everybody.